Just a couple housekeeping points before we get started. While we're discussing the cannabis legalization and the legislation, we're not here to discuss the merits of the legislation, whether you agree with it, whether you disagree with it. It is coming, so let's figure out how we're going to move forward and deal with it. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a background on the federal legislation. As you all know, in April of 2017, the federal government introduced the Federal Cannabis Act, more commonly known as Bill C-45. The purpose of the bill, according to the federal government, this isn't me, is to keep cannabis out of the hands of youth and keeping profits out of the hands of criminals and organized crime, and to reduce the burden on the judicial system. The Federal Cannabis Act permits individuals to cultivate up to 4 plants, and what's important to note here for you guys is there is no size restriction on that legislation. There is no restriction on the number of times those plants can be harvested. The seeds do have to be purchased from a licensed cannabis retailer. So in Alberta, we have Bill 26, which is the Provincial Act to Control and Regulate Cannabis. Bill 26 amends the Alberta Gaming and Liquor Act to become the Gaming, Liquor and Cannabis Act, and it deals primarily with sale and distribution of cannabis, so primarily the retail sector. The Alberta Cannabis Act also amends the Municipal Government Act to require municipalities' land use bylaws to be consistent with the applicable requirements of the Gaming, Liquor, and Cannabis Act. In Alberta, and this is important to note, municipalities cannot prohibit or opt out of permitting cannabis retail, but they can regulate the locations as to where they can be placed, and they can restrict and enforce standards. Where cannabis can be grown in the residential sector on a property will be dealt with primarily through bylaws and property accessory uses. The most common question we're going to get is what happens with noise, what happens with smells, what happens with all of these things. So that's typically going to be dealt with by either existing nuisance bylaws, which can be amended, or the municipality may choose to create new bylaws to address that. So what does this mean for you? Well, let's start off talking about renters and condo dwellers, because that's the question I get most often. What's going to happen in those areas? So the provincial government has announced that landlords will be able to restrict the growth and use of cannabis in rental properties. They are going to come out with additional information that explains what the policies are going to be and what the caps on those restrictions that landlords and condo boards can put on will be. The government will work to educate the landlords and renters. So it's important that you're proactive when you're listing properties or working with buyers as it relates to properties that are multi-unit properties, namely condos, to determine what the current existing bylaws are going to be, and ensuring that your buyers understand what they are, and also advising your sellers. A lot of times sellers don't read the bylaws, as you know, in their condo complexes, and may want to advertise that something is possible when it's not. The next issue that I get most commonly asked relates to material latent defects and stigmas. And while Doug Dixon from RECA over here is going to speak a little bit more to that, I'm going to give you some general information. So, as we know, stigmas don't always have to be disclosed. Material latent defects do. But as Robin mentioned when she was discussing some of the topics earlier, you can't refuse to answer a question. So if asked, has pot ever been grown in the property? The choices are either to answer honestly or say that your client doesn't want that information passed out and refuse to answer the question. It's important that you get this information from your clients at the outset of your listing presentations so that you're not catching them off guard when someone asks the question. The worst thing you can do is say to a potential buyer, I don't know what my client wants to say to that, so I'm gonna have to call you back later. And then you potentially risk losing the sale. Mortgages are interesting. The financial institutions haven't come out with any, at least that I've been able to find, any blanket policies as it relates to cannabis. They still say that they're going to approve mortgages individually and on their own merit. Some mortgages already do have clauses in them that restrict cannabis growth on properties. It's going to be important for your sellers to know when they're listing the property if that's an existing term in the contract or in their mortgage contract. It's also going to be important when you're dealing with buyers that they ask these questions of their lender or mortgage broker ahead of waiving conditions. If the lender has a blanket policy prohibiting the growth of cannabis, this may affect them come closing if the lender finds out and it hasn't been disclosed to them. Make sure you have the conversations with your clients before you waive conditions on the purchase contract to avoid any surprises. Insurance companies are in a similar position. They haven't come out with any sort of blanket statement as to what they're going to do, but we do know that a large number of insurance policies out there have restrictions related to cannabis growth. This can create problems for sellers who are planning on growing cannabis. It could void their policies during the listing term, which could create problems if there's a fire in the property prior to the property being sold and no way to recover the costs. It's also going to be important if you're working with buyers to ensure that you tell your buyers to speak to their insurance providers prior to waiving any conditions on the property, because if the insurance provider does find out that cannabis has been grown, even if it's not the buyer that's planning on growing it, they may either jack up the rates prior to closing or refuse to insure the property, which could create an issue then for the mortgage, and the lender may choose not to fund the mortgage if the property can't be insured. Most insurance companies have said they're going to wait to see if the number of claims from property damage of marijuana growth increases, and they'll respond accordingly as it relates to rates. Consumers should speak with their insurance agent directly, and if they become aware that cannabis has been grown in or on the property, they should advise the insurance broker immediately. Home inspections are something that most people suggest their clients have anyways, potential buyers. Many home inspectors in Alberta have voiced concerns over the damage that cannabis growth can cause in homes, namely humidity. Depending on how an indoor garden is ventilated, mold growth can be a major concern. Anecdotally, I can tell you from builders that I've spoken to, is that cannabis tends to put off about as much humidity as a tomato plant. So depending on where it's grown in the property, if it's grown in a terracotta pot on the counter, there may be little to no risk of damage to the property. If it's a more sophisticated grow operation where we're dealing with potential ventilation issues, a hydroponic scenario, there's a greater risk of damage to the property. So it's important to always advise your client to have a home inspection. If there is concern as to whether or not there was cannabis grown on the property and the seller has either refused to disclose it or maybe has admitted that they've grown it, you want to indicate that to the home inspector so that they can look for some of the telltale signs of damage to the property. They can look for moistures with their moisture meters. They can look for rerouted electricity. They can look for siphoning electricity and potential fire hazards and work that may have been done without a permit. Sellers may wish, and this is a really important point, sellers may wish, if they have grown cannabis on the property and they are willing to disclose it, to have a pre-sale home inspection. So that may assuage a lot of the fears that buyers will have when they hear that cannabis has been grown, especially if they're unsure as to how the cannabis was grown or where or how large the grow operation is. As I mentioned before, while there's a 4-plant restriction, for medical cannabis growth, it's significantly higher, and with more plants comes a greater risk of damage to the property. So a pre-sale home inspection is a great way to sort of head off any concerns that a buyer may have. Multi-family homes comes up next. So with the drive towards densification of inner city neighborhoods, developers are building more multi-unit dwellings, and I'm talking primarily duplexes, quadruplexes, and triplexes. Illegal activities connected to legal grow operations, such as siphoning electricity from a neighboring unit, can be a problem. This I saw at my time with the Real Estate Council of BC over and over again. Theft of electricity from a neighboring unit can cause extremely high electrical bills and create fire hazards. Do your due diligence. If there's any indication that a neighboring property that's attached to the property your client is looking at purchasing has been growing cannabis, try and find out as much information as you can. Keep your buyers apprised of the information you're finding out and let them make their own decision as to how they want to proceed. While a home inspector can't go into a neighbor's home, maybe they can, usually they're not going to be able to go into a neighbor's home and dig through the property to find out whether any of these things have happened. They can certainly look to see if anyone had tapped into your unit's electrical meters, if they've tried to bypass anything, or if moisture has seeped through the walls and has created a potential health hazard in the property that you've listed. Commercial real estate is another area of concern. So I'm speaking primarily to the residential side, but on the commercial side, one of the concerns that we hear from people who are looking to purchase properties is, I don't want to buy a property in an area where there's going to be a cannabis retail location. It's really important that you understand the zoning bylaws for each municipality. Every municipality can set its own rules and regulations as to where they're going to permit these retail spots to pop up. You need to find out where they're going to be. And if you do that in advance of showing your client, let's say they're looking in Bridgeland, if you were to pull the zoning applications for Bridgeland, you can see how many applications have been submitted. You can see whether there's potential for a cannabis retail location to pop up in that neighborhood and advise your client accordingly. That way, at least they know down the road, either there's a chance or there's no chance that this is going to happen. There are restrictions that the city is planning on putting in around distances from parks, distances from schools. There is talk of what they're calling now cannabis parks that are going to pop up, which are public locations that people are going to be able to flock to go smoke for some reason. You know, at least identifying where those locations are and how close they are to potential properties that your client is interested in may affect their decision to buy that property. They may be willing to pay more for that property. They may want to pay less, who knows, or they may opt to just look somewhere else, but at least they have the information and they can make their own decisions at that point. Pardon?
Convenience store.
Yeah, exactly. So, finally, what I want to talk about is the term grow up. So everyone has their own definition of the term. Courts have their own definition, realtors have their own definition, buyers and sellers have their own definition. It's very quick and it's very easy to just say to a seller, has this property been used as a grow up? In British Columbia, I know some of you are licensed over there as well. They have a form called a property condition disclosure statement. And there's a question on that form that sellers fill out where they can make any disclosures that they want. There is a question, has the property ever been used as a grow up? Here's the problem under the new legislation. Most members of the public will identify a grow up as an illegal grow operation. That's not necessarily the case. So if you want to ask the question on behalf of your clients, be as specific as you possibly can. The better question is, has cannabis ever been grown in or on the property? The answer may be, I refuse to answer that question. It may be yes, it may be no, but at least you're not going to sell the property where the seller is interpreting the term grow up as an illegal operation when they have been growing legal cannabis on the property. And then because of that stigma, your buyer is now upset and coming back and filing complaints and saying that, you know, they weren't provided accurate information. It's too subjective, so you want to make sure you're getting as specific as you possibly can when asking those questions. I think ultimately what it's going to come down to from the board's perspective is ensuring that as the legislation is passed, as the new rules come in, and we know it's been so fluid at this point and nothing is set in stone yet, we're going to get that information out to you. It's important to ask the questions, and it's important to get legal advice when you don't know the answer. So start with your broker. You can always call into the board. You can call into RECA if you have a question. If you can't get an answer that's sufficient or that speaks to exactly what you need to know, get legal advice. Steer away from providing legal advice to any of your clients because that's a huge risk to you. And that's pretty much everything I have. So I'm going to turn it over to Doug. Doug is going to speak to what RECA's position is, what the legislation says, and then we'll move on to Dave.
Good morning. I'd like to start my comments by pointing out that this is, of course, a new regulatory issue for RECA. RECA will have to be looking at the issues as they evolve and respond and develop over time. RECA belongs to a national real estate regulators group that most of the provinces and territories belong to, so we'll be having ongoing discussion and research happening on a national level to see how this whole cannabis issue affects us in the regulatory world and what kind of responses we as regulators should be coming out with. There are lots of issues, many of which Ryan has already touched on. I will say that I personally believe the issue of homeowners growing cannabis has been overblown from a couple of points of view. For instance, how many people will actually grow cannabis in their homes? Think about it. Homeowners can make wine at home. Many of you might have tried. Starter kits and equipment are all readily available. When I was a young boy, a very, very long time ago, my father did it. He made wine. After a 5-gallon carboy exploded in the storage room late one night from not being, the pressure being set properly, The winemaking experiment ended. How many people are actually successful at making their own wine? Think about it. How many people do you know as personal friends or as clients at houses you go in? It's a rare thing that people that do it. And many people who do it make one or two really bad batches and say this isn't worth it, and that's the end of it. Most people are happier to go to a local store that has a huge selection and just buy the product there. And I don't think it's going to be a whole lot different when it comes to cannabis. Most people aren't going to be creating these personal farms of cannabis. An issue I often hear about is growing plants at home will cause huge problems for the property. Again, let's be realistic about what most people will do. Legal recreational cannabis is limited to 4 plants. Ryan made the comment with regards to being the same as a tomato plant. I currently have about 8 large tropical plants in my house, and probably 15 or 20 smaller plants scattered around the house. Is that a big issue? Should we be concerned when I go to sell my house about mold issues and humidity and all these things? I mean, 4 plants is what we're talking about if somebody's doing it legally. So it's not uncommon that people grow plants. Why are 4 plants that happen to be cannabis such a huge deal? Now, if you run into somebody that's not paying attention to the law and is growing rooms full of plants, that's a whole different operation. But if somebody's, which I think most people will do, will abide, that try this, will abide by the law with 4 plants, then it's really not such a big issue. Then there's the size of plants. I've had so many times people say to me, oh, but these cannabis plants can be huge. Well, again, let's be logical about this. How many homeowners are going to allow cannabis plants to create a jungle in their living room or wherever where they live? It just doesn't seem very practical to me. All the concerns that get raised on an ongoing basis, the comments about electricity, and Ryan touched on that. We think about people stealing electricity because they're doing illegal grow-ops. They don't want the expense of the electricity on their bill, and they don't want the hint to the law enforcement agencies when their bill spikes up that something unusual is going on that property. So there were reasons why people stole electricity and bypassed meters and did all that stuff. But who can you see that's growing 4 plants go to all that trouble? So again, I think we talk about these things, but in reality, how much of it is actually going to happen? I would agree that if a property is being used for a much larger number of plants, so if somebody is growing plants for medicinal purposes, they're restricted up to 40 plants. And now we're talking something much more significant. So although they may not be doing anything illegal, and then there may not be issues about electricity, but depending on how they've structured their grow operation, there could be humidity problems, which lead to moisture problems. So there could be real problems legitimately for a legal operation of somebody growing it for medicinal purposes. Ryan touched on this, is the issue often raised about grow-ops from a negative point of view. I hear the legal growing of recreational or medicinal cannabis often compared to illegal grow-ops that have caused huge damage to properties. Starting October 17th, and people have to get their head around this, growing cannabis within the legal limits is allowable. That's not a grow-op in our traditional sense that we've thought about it. If somebody has 4 plants for recreational purposes or up to 40 plants for medicinal, that is not what we think about as a grow-op historically. It's now legal. And you know, our society has to change its thinking a little bit around this. So we should be careful not to be mixing up legal cannabis with illegal grow-ops. At this point, RECA believes that the issue of cannabis as it relates to home sales can be dealt with under existing rules. I'll comment on sellers and buyers separately. Sellers, well, what does a seller have to disclose? They will not have to disclose whether or not cannabis has been grown or smoked on the property. Flat out, there will be no legal requirement because it's not an illegal action. They will not have to disclose it unless asked. And if they're asked, if there's no significant, I jumped ahead of myself here. If there's no significant damage to the property, they're within their legal limits, there's no material latent defect, then there is no real requirement for a seller to disclose anything. They only, in Alberta, have to disclose material latent defects. So if growing 4 plants or 40 plants hasn't caused any material latent defect, there is no requirement for the seller to disclose anything. That's not unlike anything else. The seller can instruct their representative to either disclose or to refuse to answer. It's the seller's directions. And as Ryan said, you need to have that conversation with your sellers early on before the property goes on the market so that you know what position the seller's going to take. This would be the same for any other issue that a seller is not legally obligated to disclose. Industry members listing a property should be making themselves aware of this issue as they do with any other issues regarding a property they're going to list. You should be asking questions of the seller, discussing as appropriate, and asking for their instructions as to how they would want to deal with questions if the seller has either grown or smoked cannabis on the property. If an industry member sees evidence of possible physical property issues related to cannabis, they should discuss it with their seller. Buyers. As with sellers, there is nothing really new with regard to practice and representation of buyers. Industry members are required to fully represent their buyer clients, which includes asking them if there are any issues or concerns that would prevent them from buying a property. These have typically been stigmas that may be a concern to some buyers, but not to others, such as a death on the property, a haunted property, and many other similar stigmas. Now, industry members should be asking if their buyer has any concerns about a property that may have been used to grow cannabis or where it was smoked. For some people, that's a stigma. For other people, they could care less. So you have to ask your buyer, where do they sit on the subject? Is it a concern or is it not a concern? If the buyer does have concerns, then the industry member will have to ask listing associates appropriate questions. So when you're making appointments, you'd have to ask the question, has the property ever been used to grow marijuana or grow cannabis? And if the answer is yes, and that was a concern for your buyer, then you have to have that discussion with the buyer to let them know that's a property that there has been cannabis grown on or smoked in, depending on what the answer that comes back is. So from a buyer's perspective, we don't see it as being any different than protecting your buyer, acting professionally with your buyers, and ensuring that their concerns and their risks are taken into account. So in closing, this is a huge social issue with many points of view. There will be many challenges down the road for homeowners, landlords, renters, condominium corporations, buyers, and all levels of government to deal with. I believe the biggest challenge and solution will be education on this issue. Do your best to keep yourself informed and current on the issues as they arise. Thank you.
Morning. This meeting is early. The reason it's early is this stuff isn't legal till October the 17th. And I can tell you that the Chief Retirement Officer and Chief Executive Officer of REIX wanted to take some of your premium money and distribute complimentary edibles. Unfortunately, we can't make that happen today. We've had a look around, consulted with our legal folks in terms of what information that we could get you dealing with this kind of thing. And the problem with it is there's very little out there. There have only been 5 cases in Canada that deal with this. 2 of them in Ontario and the other 3 in British Columbia, which I'm sure comes as a surprise to everybody in here.
There's only 3?
There's only 3. There's only 3. The case focused around the realtor having knowledge that these properties had cannabis being grown in them, or in the alternative were grow-ups. In both cases, they were dismissed for lack of evidence. And here's where this whole mess starts getting murky. The courts, as both these gentlemen to my right have said, have not defined what a grow op is. Is it 5? Is it 100? Is it 200? They haven't gone there. The only direction that we can take from the courts is what they have said is it's an accepted theory or principle that the definition of a grow op is an enterprise that is there for commercial purposes, be it licit or illicit. So we can take from that. I think it would be unfair to categorize somebody who's got 4 plants in their house as having a grow op. I don't see that. I will, a little bit later on, perhaps in the Q&A area, sort of hone in on a couple of the points that the judges made. There is a very interesting case about a tenant that had 4 plants in his rental, and he was kicked out by the landlord, and the landlord subsequently sued for breach of the lease and stigmatizing his property. That case went to, believe it or not, the federal courts, and what the judges came down on with that was really interesting, and they actually hired experts to determine whether or not a property was stigmatized. And not dissimilar to any other case where you have experts on the part of the plaintiff and defendants, each advocating each other's positions. Usually experts' opinions are based on either empirical data or contractual issues that can be defined by the courts. What the federal judge found in this case was fascinating. He said that because of the nature of cannabis, the ideology, the personal ideology of the experts entered into their opinion and sufficiently swayed it that the federal courts were not going to put any weight in the experts' opinions on either side of the action. So that was a fascinating finding. So where do we go with this? As both Doug and Ryan have said, this all comes down to disclosure. When you're talking to your sellers, I absolutely agree with Ryan. The question is, have you grown cannabis in the property? I think that the average rank and file public is not going to say 2, 3 plants as a grow up. So defining and helping the seller is of paramount importance. With the issue of disclosure, as Doug says, if the seller says don't disclose it, then I think that you have an obligation to explain the ramifications of following that instruction. Here's what's going to happen, because we all know what's going to happen. The neighbor's going to sue it, right? And then you reassess whether or not, quite candidly, you want to take that listing, because now you're going to be potentially wearing that if it sues. So you can go exactly according to the rules and still protect yourself by simply saying, I'm not prepared to take this listing. I don't want to run that liability risk. All right. The courts that came out with a couple of interesting comments, and I don't want to bore you by reading a lot of this stuff. The other thing you may want to be cautious of is if the police bust a property and it's got 5 plants in it, chances are they're going to call it a grow up. So that's why questioning exactly what's in this property becomes so important. There was a case in Ontario that spoke exactly to that, and that was 4 plants. It was not legal at the time, but it was 4. And all of a sudden, this property is now showing up all over the places as a grow up. The only thing, we got a number of legal opinions on this. One of the ones that was interesting is a realtor. This was an article that appeared in Ontario, and it related to that Ontario case that I was talking to you about. And it says in the Gilbert v. Benoit decision, where the court declined to apply the label grow op in a civil dispute, the tenant grew 4 plants, the same number that the new law will permit per household in Alberta. The court said that this was not a grow operation in any meaningful sense of the word. Now I turn to this article that this realtor in Ontario penned. And he writes that there's been some speculation in the media that even growing the permitted 4 plants will cause damage to houses. Legalizing marijuana could mean more people will grow pot, which may hurt real estate sales, say city and national realty officials. The looming federal legislation to legalize cannabis use also states people can grow up to 4 plants in a home, but each pot plant can grow to more than 6 feet and yield 4 crops per year, posing a risk of water mold damage inside a home, said, and I'm not going to say who it was, a London realtor who is also the director of Ontario Region for the Canadian Real Estate Association, and a board member of the Ontario Real Estate Association. Talk about slaughtering your young. It says there'll be consequences of growing marijuana at homes. It does not sound like a lot, but only 4 plants can do a lot of damage, says this guy. It's really a mini grow op. Well, here's our take on this and that of council and the way the courts went, and this is where I'm talking about this decision. It is entirely possible that the opinion expressed in this news story about 4 plants doing a lot of damage, as Doug says, is overblown and unsupported. Opinions in this area are frequently influenced by the individual's personal beliefs for or against marijuana use and the legalization, as a federal court judge found in 2016. And now I'm going to go to what I alluded to earlier. What he says is Allard v. HMQ, the federal court heard a charter challenge to the federal regulations governing medical marijuana, and in particular the prohibition on home growing brought in by Health Canada under the Harper government. This required the judge to weigh the pros and cons of home growing. The federal court judge heard from many expert witnesses on both sides of the issue, and the judge finally remarked that expert witnesses were too often committed to their own side to give objectives helpful to the court. So that's how unresolved this entire mess is. The only advice I can give you on behalf of your insurer, and I would back up RECA and your board on this one, is follow the rules of disclosure. And the only question you need to ask yourself is, you get that instruction not to disclose, you got to look in the mirror and say, do I want to run this risk by following that instruction? Oh, you don't look that confused. That's unusual. We can talk about RMS if you like.
Thank you very much. I guess really the key takeaways are going to be have the discussions early, whether you're working with a buyer or seller, get all the information at the outset. That way there's no surprises. If your seller asks you not to disclose, you can make a decision before you take the listing as to whether or not you want to take the listing. If the seller advises you to disclose, get that instruction in writing. If you're working with a buyer, again, talk about stigmas, anything that may concern them about the property. It could be death on the property, it could be cannabis growth, it could be, as Doug pointed out, haunted houses, and I've seen that as well. If you get all that information at the outset, there's very few things that can rock the boat as you work your way through the transaction. Your buyer is going to understand that you're working in their best interest, that you have their best interests at heart, that you're asking the questions that they want to know the answers to, and that's the best way to protect yourself.